when we look at kind of the next 5 years, I don't think the goal is full harmonization. I think it's interoperability. And that's really the key piece here is how can nations move within their own timelines, within their own steps, within their own means, but still in a coordinated and cohesive way forward, even if it's not identical to their peers.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is presented by Base Carbon, sensible carbon investing. For more information, visit basecarbon.com.
Welcome back to Catching Up on Climate on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abex Technologies. Our guest today is Hannah Hauman, Global Head of Carbon Trading at Trafigura. We'll be catching up on how Article 6 and CORSIA are reshaping the global carbon markets and how countries are now framing their environmental goals, setting their climate ambitions, and building new compliance carbon emissions markets in a multipolar world. Hello, Hannah. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Great to be here. Thanks, Dave.
Well, it's great to have you here. This happens to be our 250th episode of the podcast, and also a first because we're sitting here today recording in person at the IETA North America Climate Summit 2025 in New York City. And so thank you for taking the time to be with us in the studio, Hannah.
Absolutely.
We're calling this series Catching Up on Climate, and I always look forward to catching up with you to get your perspective and your insights on what's happening and where we're going next in the carbon markets. And so far at the conference, it seems like a pretty good buzz. And, we had Dirk Forrester, the president of IETA, on the podcast last week. And he noted that we're in a world where the rules of Article 6 were largely settled at COP29 in Baku last year. And that while there's a lot of noise in Washington, on the other side of the globe, markets are starting to blossom. And I think you have a panel at the conference a little bit on that theme tomorrow. And so if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of start where I left off with Dirk last week, which is, how do you think about carbon markets in this kind of post-Article 6 CORSIA world? Whether it's the demand, the supply, or even just this eternal notion of quality. Like, what's a quality investment grade credit in an Article 6 CORSIA world today?
Big question to start out with. So as we're really looking at the landscape going forward within Article 6, and actually something you and I have talked about before is this concept of we are creating kind of the first real global carbon market, not in the form of everything's homogenous and everything's the same, but that everything's standardized and that you actually have the ability to have differentiated preferences on top of a standardized framework. So that Article 6 rulebook that's now being developed means that we now actually have centralized registries, we have defined methodologies or project types that are eligible compliance grade for international trade, and then also kind of the rule book for what countries need to do in terms of participating, either on the buy side or on the export side. So when we think about quality and how we kind of define that new definition of investment grade, we see a lot of the same hallmarks as we did before. So things like, what is the actual operational quality? Does it deliver when it should, how much it should, and on the timing that it should? So all of those things still exist, as these are still underlying physical assets behind the credits. But the new, let's say, variable that we've put into play is now export grade or export quality, which within an Article 6 context just means the exporting country has not only given approvals for the project, but has also issued a corresponding adjustment or export approval for that credit to now be traded and now be legal tender within Paris Agreement balances. So that is an entirely new paradigm that the market is now grappling with. It is less infrastructure-based, so not so much reliant on digital tools or methodologies, but very much policy-based, as now you're needing countries to decide from an exporting basis, what types of activities do they want to export? What are the appropriate export fees? How does that change over time? Do they want to have a subset which is whitelisted for domestic, a subset for international, so on and so forth? And all we're kind of doing is putting additional policy layers on top to enable this global trade. But in truth, it's not that dissimilar to what we see on every other commodity. So we have some playbooks to pull from. But that's, I think, really how we're changing the definition of what investment grade is we've now added this additional criteria on, does it have export approvals, and is it now legal tender under Article 6?
And it does seem like we're moving much more towards a more typical commodity market structure. For years, when people were working through the issues in the voluntary carbon markets, it was always what's creating the demand. It wasn't policy, it was net zero commitments, and lots of debate that we don't need to revisit about that. When you look at it from the buyer side, or the demand that's being created now in this post-Article 6 compliance world, what is the demand side like? What are the buyers like in this market?
Article 6 is an interesting beast because, on one hand, it is a standardized market, standardized framework. On the other hand, your buy side set and your use cases are actually highly differentiated. So I'll kind of pick apart 3 different examples and we can kind of tease that out. The simplest one, let's say, is CORSIA. So that would be the airlines, the global compliance market for aviation, and where they are buying CORSIA eligible credits that is using Article 6 infrastructure or has that export approvals. And the airlines are primarily concerned about the same things they're concerned about jet. So is it on time? Is it at the price I agreed? The quantity, the specification, so on and so forth. And their real focus is, timing, specification, delivery. So I would say much more generic specifications in that if it is CORSIA specification, it now fits. The second class of buyer is a little bit different. This is also a private sector buyer, even though it's under Article 6, because what we're now seeing is governments really engaging in Article 6 via their domestic compliance markets by enabling the import of international credits. So here you see a little bit more nuance, and where some companies are really falling on, okay, I just want the guaranteed specification, give me what I need when I need it, and we'll move on. Others are maybe having certain preferences for subsets. And that could be because of their own climate goals of, for example, if they now want the optionality to use that also for net zero offsetting. So all of a sudden they might change specifications a bit. Or alternatively, if they are an obligated party in multiple schemes, and now they want that subset to now be able to fulfill multiple use cases for them. So that is, I would say, the most varied group by a long shot and kind of covers in between. And then on the far side of things is the sovereign. So these are countries that are engaging directly on direct procurement. And you see a lot of diverse preferences where, ironically, despite it being an international compliance market, it has the behavioral aspects very much of the voluntary market in terms of individual countries want to see different things. For example, Singapore has just issued a nature-based sovereign procurement tender, whereas if we look at Switzerland, they actually don't allow for nature-based at all. So there's a lot of, I would say, individuality in terms of how countries are progressing. That applies to project type in terms of if they're really passionate about a specific technology. So you see a lot of policy around engineered carbon removal at the moment because countries want to be a part of spurring that on, but then equally countries of origin. So that's quite standard where you will see, I would say, a gating of where projects are originating from as countries are really focused on who are those trading partners and what are those trade lanes that they're establishing, and is it supporting their wider goals? So I think that's probably the, I would say, most commoditized to perhaps the least commoditized. But I would say in every instance, the buyer is again, the one effectively setting the specifications, even within that regulation. But those specifications are quite clear and therefore clear market fundamentals.
I remember coming for this conference for years. Obviously, the International Emissions Trading Association, the ask for years of governments was just tell us what the rules are, tell us what counts as quality. It sounds like we're moving in that direction, but countries are being more experimental in what they want to see as quality. Is that right?
Yeah. So again, I would call back to this concept of standardized framework and standardized rulebook, but still with this ability to exercise different preferences. So this isn't so dissimilar from the traditional commodity markets. If we look at the global diesel market, this is one of the most commoditized products on the planet. And yet you actually see highly different specifications if you go country by country based on physical properties they require. So things like sulfur, like flash, like pour, these are a little bit nuanced. So I'd kind of liken it in the same space of we have a shared definition of the accounting and the qualities of what is eligible, but countries still have this space to say, all right, this is who I want to trade with, and equally, these are the types of activities I'd really like to support.
And when you turn to the supply side in the current market, Is this now, this shared framework, creating more commercial opportunities and more investment flowing into carbon reduction and removal projects for the exporting countries?
So what we generally see is pre-regulation, which Article 6 was agreed last year in Baku. In reality, you've only seen kind of the first transactions this year under the bespoke arrangement with 6.2. Next year is the standardized registry, which will allow a lot more capital to flow. But broadly, what we see is in a generally pre-regulatory world, investors are a little bit more shy. So this is now venture capital realm, right? So do you have the risk tolerance? Can you understand not only your asset operations, but the technical architecture, the policy architecture? That can be challenging for some investors. That said, you do see a lot of specialized investors in the space that are going deeper than ever before, ourselves included, frankly, because we do see direction of travel and we see the opportunity. But what I would expect is as we migrate into the next 12 to 24 months with much more concrete and easily understandable rules, we are now in a post-regulatory world, and you're now investing in a known versus a supposition of what will occur.
And do you see more companies coming into that space, moving up the ladder and kind of educating themselves so that they'll be ready to be investors? Or do you think that'll become a bottleneck in the investment pipeline?
I think right now, the very common approach that we see, and this is true not just for investors, but also for commercial banking, for example, where another part of the financial architecture that's really developed has been around project finance offerings that have really come a long way. In every instance, broadly speaking, most of these transactions are first, second, or potentially third of their kind. So we are still doing the first of large-scale pilots under Article 6. What you typically see is that you will have a lead investor or lead financier that is really taking the time and capacity to learn, and then ultimately syndicating to others in the space to bring them along. So in truth, I think you see headlines that have very few names, but if you were to kind of peel the layers, I actually think you'd see a much wider assortment of players that are now engaging and investing in this space. But it's kind of who's taking that lead role, who is the first mover, and then those second movers are benefiting from those shared learnings.
Well, I'd like to turn now towards something you've been referring to, and you're speaking to this on your panel tomorrow, which is that we're seeing many national and regional compliance schemes, compliance markets developing and ramping up around the world. And what do you believe are the most important developments that people should be watching? Like, what are the big macro themes that you're following?
It's pretty incredible at the moment. I'm sure I've said this in the past, but I think the headlines are almost a challenge to keep up with, frankly, because of this, the pace and the frequency of iteration that we see. And it's not really any one single market. It's kind of everywhere all at once at the moment. So to kind of boil that up to the macro themes that we're seeing, I think one is a general growth for the first time in the last few years of true compliance demand. So we're all used to seeing these charts that say X amount of GHG emissions under carbon pricing, and nominally that looks like it increases every year. The reality has been that actually free allocations under the schemes means that your net demand or your real compliance coverage has actually been pretty stagnant for really the last 4 years. And I think this was a bit of the whiplash that the market had when we're preparing for all this growth, and actually governments weren't necessarily tightening the schemes in the way that everyone intended. That is now changing. So as we look into next year, what we're now seeing is for the first time a very real lift in things like reduction of those free allocations, which is overall increasing the total compliance demand. That's a big trend in markets like Europe in particular, which is going into its next stage of the EU ETS, but also in new markets like China, which is adding new industries and also rejigging that free allocation to change the market structure. The second piece of this, I would say, is beyond, I would say, just existing markets that are now having kind of new levers and tightening. We're seeing on a widespread scale the incorporation of credits within the regulatory design. So in some instances, that is domestic only. So again, I'll use Europe as an example. Historically, Europe's been against credits within the compliance scheme, but is now unveiling the EU CRCF, which is now deeming removal specifications with the intention to bring it in from post-2030. Other jurisdictions are incorporating it into the regulatory markets for imports. So markets like Korea, markets like Japan, that are actually leveraging Article 6 to be able to pull in those Article 6 credits via the domestic regulatory scheme. So I think those two things we see is kind of the big trajectories coming. One being just a generally larger market in the terms of net demand and governments getting more comfortable going up those next layers. And the second is the concept of credits and specifically domestic or internationally traded credits really at the core of each of these designs.
I'd love to dig into that a little bit more with you because we've talked a lot about Europe and its leadership in the space. Clearly, the US has kind of stepped away, leaving Europe in the leadership seat. And I was curious, you do have the issue now where the net credits are starting to bite for the first time. You've got CBAM and trying to export some of that abroad. How important is Europe's leadership in the compliance markets? And is it looked to as kind of a template by other countries for how to set up their own emission trading schemes?
It's an interesting question. So I think a few years ago, I absolutely would have said Europe is leading categorically and everyone else is quite a distant second or third. That feels a lot more balanced these days. Part of that is, frankly, I think because of the US's absence. The more that the US retreats, the greater the space is for others to occupy. So, for example, we've seen China come out very loudly asserting that this is a core construct for them and this is a core part of their national strategy. Europe, of course, has asserted again and again, this is a core part of our strategy. And we're now seeing them export policy in the form of things like CBAM, CSRD, so on and so forth. But in truth, we're seeing a lot of countries step forward. So players like Japan is getting extremely active in, I would say, funding more of the technology side and the equity side elsewhere, but also developing their own domestic markets. Players like Singapore are leading the way in terms of these bilateral agreements under Article 6. So again, it's not necessarily just one factor or one nation that's necessarily leading. We really do see this, I would say, disaggregated but coordinated effort in terms of how countries are really coming to pull together, even though all of their ambitions and kind of motivations differ kind of slightly here or there. That said, governments absolutely do love to borrow best practices. So a lot of what our team does, we trade in the global regulatory markets. We're very active in every single one. And as much as these are isolated markets that in theory do not touch one another in some respects, the team is constantly watching what's happening elsewhere in the world. Because it's well known that governments like to try to borrow the mousetrap to kind of improve their own when they see a policy that's working.
No need to reinvent the wheel. And when you look at this multipolar world that you're describing, do you see the frameworks, the ambitions, the quality measures being similar enough that these could converge or be compatible with each other over time? I guess China would be the big question, right? Is what's happening in China close enough to what's happening outside of China at some level that it could integrate?
So I think the answer is no, but then yes. So in the short term, really to 2030, absolutely not. And that's mostly because you just have vastly different geographies, different economic situations, different geographic availabilities. Are you relying on land use? Are you relying on geologic storage? A plan in the Middle East for decarbonization just looks vastly different to a plan in Singapore, for example, just based on your kind of natural environment. However, I would caveat that with a then yes. So in 2040, once we've all kind of climbed the curve, and I've probably said before, but I always kind of think about net zero as this shared finish line, but people on very different starting points. So in the beginning, it looks quite chaotic, fragmented, very difficult, I think, to kind of compare apples to apples. But as that curve progresses, you really see people kind of getting on the same page. What that really means in the short term is things like CBAM are not a bug, they are a feature, as that's ultimately going to account for the differences in terms of regional ambition, which again, I think is highly appropriate. But equally, I don't think we see that as a concern for the market. When we look at kind of the next 5 years, I don't think the goal is full harmonization. I think it's interoperability. And that's really the key piece here is how can nations move within their own timelines, within their own steps, within their own means, but still in a coordinated and cohesive way forward, even if it's not identical to their peers.
And so as we move into this world where the emphasis and the focus seems to be much more about the climate action that countries are taking rather than corporations, I kind of wanted to get your sense of how countries are thinking about fair climate action? And in particular, when we think about framing of environmental goals, like what are the main factors shaping different countries' ambitions and their NDCs?
So this is one of the, I think previously it was a misconception and now it's just completely been about face. But in 2020, 2021, there was a lot of hype, a lot of excitement, and I think people were playing offense with climate. Even countries, right? We saw it a lot with companies, but especially countries on what does this do reputationally? How am I making a name for myself? How am I stepping forward? So again, much more offensive and framed a little bit more within the frame of philanthropy. That has changed really substantially to be one that is now much more about energy security or energy independence, much more about trade relations. There's a little bit going on in the world right now about cross-border trade in particular, for example. So if you actually look, each country is slightly different in terms of their focus, but it's not about necessarily doing good things. It's about how they are protecting their long-term competitiveness of their countries and their economies. So, for example, yesterday I was listening to the state legislature of California talking primarily about air quality. And yes, CO2 reductions is obviously also a core pillar of this, but what their citizens experience every single day is actually the air quality difference of when they're able to reduce emissions. If you speak to other players in Europe, for example, it's very much about energy independence and how are they building out renewable capacity so that they are not reliant on foreign fossil fuel imports. If you travel elsewhere in the world, in New Zealand, they will talk a lot about erosion. So a lot of their carbon pricing and carbon scheme relies on actually afforestation and creation of new forests to really just protect the island from desertification and erosion of the natural environment. So again, every government has slightly different kind of views of how they're pursuing this, but pretty much every single one is focused on self-interest, on how do I ensure affordability for my citizens? How do I reduce things like insurance damage, which is becoming an increasingly hot topic? And then on the international side of things, how do I improve those trading relationships in a multipolar world? How am I strengthening those key corridors with those nations I'm already working with in order to reduce my overall mitigation cost? So again, I would say highly varied, but with some very core centralized themes there.
And I want to come back to talk about country level NDCs, but I want to ask you first so much of, before stepping away from the voluntary carbon market topic, one thing that was always a strength of the voluntary carbon markets was getting investment dollars into projects. So I wanted to ask you, like, what is the outlook for carbon reduction and removal projects in more of a compliance world? Do they find a home in the compliance markets?
Yeah, of course. So, and I might actually split that in two if you don't mind. So I think first, as much as it looks like the voluntary market has quieted, and equally we've been very vocal advocates for voluntary actually becoming quasi regulated. In truth, you are seeing actually more dollars flowing into that space now than you ever have. And I think the real difference there is the difference between spot retirements or immediate use of credits versus forward commitments and transactions. If you were to actually take into account forward transactions on a voluntary basis, you've had a market that's grown 5 to 6 times just in the last 2 years. Kind of belies the data that you see on a day to day. But again, it's because most companies are thinking 2030, 2040, so on and so forth. These are 15, 20-year terms often, and most of them are in the public domain in terms of announced. But I do want to qualify this first with the voluntary market we actually see growing quite substantially. It's just the flavor of that has changed. And that's very much focused on removals now as part of that netting exercise or that offsetting exercise. We would expect to see that continue to grow as we see an increased number of regulated claims legislation coming through. We're seeing that in Europe, but also in other places like the VCMI coalition, led by the UK, Singapore, and Kenya. I think there's more to come in that space, but we'll park it there. On the broader global markets in terms of project-based credits, that's really, I think, at the crux of where a lot of this new compliance or regulatory market growth is going. And to kind of paint a picture, in the last 5 years, say, if the global carbon credit market has been about 250 million tons, call it 80 to 90% of that has been voluntary. As we look forward to the end of the decade, that number gets much closer to about 800 million tons, and with 80 to 90% of that number being regulatory. So these are huge shifts in terms of the actual underpinning demand of regulation that's really pushing this forward. And I think what we see is very meaningful, both for, I would say, the general project-based credit space, but as well as the voluntary space, is the paradigm of how we are creating these credits are changing. So this is no longer international registries that people are struggling to kind of harmonize. This is now all getting roped within this regulatory paradigm in terms of what that means for the infrastructure, what that means for the assurances behind it, and the ultimate guarantor. So I think huge steps forward in terms of what we can, and what we've already seen, frankly, and also what is ahead in terms of underlying quality of project credits, and then something equally that the voluntary market can borrow from in the future.
And when you think ahead to the world through, say, the end of the decade to 2030, when you think about what's shaping and what countries are putting out as their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, is there kind of an overall theme to what you're seeing?
We're now going into stocktake world, which is kind of the 2030, 2040 goals for countries. You're seeing a number of things. I think number one, you're seeing a lot more granularity in terms of how countries are reporting on sectors, on their targets, on their goals. Not that dissimilar to what we see on a company level, frankly, just as we're kind of progressing later in time. And then the second piece, of course, is engagement within Article 6. So we've now seen over 90 countries commit within their NDCs to say, we intend to engage with Article 6, either on the buy side or the sell side. Again, everyone has slightly different reasons, but even parties like Europe, which historically have said, we will not engage with Article 6, we will be 100% domestically, is now actually changing their tune quite substantially. So post 2030, their goals and their ambitions now distinctly include Article 6. And I think for very different reasons than others, is their main concern now is how do they start to fill those residual balances now that they have really decarbonized so much domestically. So that's another, I think, key feature of the general shape of the NDCs that we're seeing. And we're due to see many more out over the next 2 months, which should be landing fast and furious leading up to the COP. But I think we're going to see a lot more hints and clues in terms of what is the firm demand and firm commitments that are already coming through. For example, we've already seen 90 million tons in current NDCs just up to 2030 from sovereigns alone. And that's when all of these are still kind of new and still coming out. So as we look into 2040, we will get a general arc of where the world is headed in terms of its general goals against Paris, and then a bit of a proliferation in terms of, okay, how much of that translates into domestic ETS balances, how much of that translates into international trading, so on and so forth.
And it's so great to be able to talk about things that are actually happening as opposed to may happen. But I do want to kind of take a little bit of a forward look. If you think of the world as we wrap up post 2030, if it's continually driven more compliance, more regulatory, obviously policy legislation is going to shape the post 2030 world. How are you thinking about that? And is there certain legislation that you think the markets either need or legislation that's in place that's going to give us a sense of what that post 2030 world looks like?
So I think between now and the end of the decade, it still feels like we're getting a bit on the starting blocks on some domestic markets, absolutely on the international trading front. And then I think a wider bucket of disclosure legislation. So it really feels like we are creating just the very strong foundations for what lies ahead, where we need these markets desperately from 2030, frankly, as you're already hitting the wall on some hard to abate sectors. And we now need kind of all the sources that we can get. So what we are keeping an eye on is, as I mentioned previously, the NDCs in terms of where are they stretching and how much of that is going to translate into domestic market growth. And can they translate into domestic market growth? For the surplus or residual of what that trade deficit or surplus is, what does that then translate into international trade? And that total Article 6 market, especially again, as you're now creating those foundations, and frankly, now your problem is actually more a lag in supply versus the creation of demand. But the point that I would really kind of hit home on, and what we really see as the most exciting development at the moment, again, I think we talked about this last year, I'm a disclosures nerd, but is around emissions reporting frameworks and disclosures. This is ultimately the bedrock of global carbon accounting and is how the world will trade and how we will ultimately measure kind of achievement of targets. So what we see happening, and I'm hearing it a lot in New York this week, it's so many, in fact, that I can't count in terms of the new coalitions. But what is a very big agenda item for COP30 is around establishment of things like product carbon footprints that are sectorally cohesive So how do we move from a world that right now looks at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and really starts to look at scope 1 and 2 and carbon intensity of products? I think that is going to completely change the game in terms of right now we think about carbon as a installation-based, as a registry-based thing, and very much within borders. That concept will completely flip it to now actually being primarily focused on cross-border trade, and specifically will influence how we talk about and how we quantify net zero, as net zero actually is scope 3 inclusive. So that completely changes the framework going forward, where again, CBAM will become the norm, not just in EU, but also in places like the UK and Australia that are already talking about their own CBAM designs and then beyond. But I think the moment that we start extending carbon footprints and carbon pricing into everyday traded materials and goods, that is just a vastly different world that we're looking at. And that's really what we're knocking on the door for 2030.
Thanks again to Hannah Hauman, Global Head of Carbon Trading at Trafigura. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Catching Up on Climate. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is presented by Base Carbon, a financier of projects involved primarily in the global voluntary carbon markets. Base Carbon endeavors to be the preferred carbon project partner in providing capital and management resources to carbon removal and abatement projects globally, and where appropriate, will utilize technologies within the evolving environmental industries to enhance efficiencies, commercial credibility, and trading transparency. For more information, visit basecarbon.com. Base Carbon, sensible carbon investing. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.